Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Brown Bag Lecture featuring Dr. Félix Mathieu, who is an assistant professor in political science at the University of Winnipeg. Today, Dr. Mathieu will discuss the distinctions between Canadian multiculturalism and interculturalism, which is prominent in the province of Quebec. He will consider Quebec Bills 21 and 96 that deal with secularism and the French language. His talk will be based on work published in his book, Taking Pluralism Seriously, which was published earlier this year. Dr. Mathieu received his PhD in political science from the Université du Québec à Montréal and his bachelor's and master's degree from Université Laval. Before his current post at the University of Winnipeg, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Catalonia, Spain. And I'm sure I mucked up that pronunciation, and I apologize. In any event, please let's welcome Dr. Félix Mathieu for this afternoon's Brown Bag Lecture.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be amongst you today, both virtually and physically here at St. Paul's College to the invitation of the Morrow Institute. I'm really happy as well because it's the first time that I actually walk up in person on campus of the University of Manitoba on St. Paul's College. So I'm quite happy to be here after being in Winnipeg for about a year and a half now. So my talk today is founded mostly on a book that I've published first in its original version in French in 2017 called Les défis du pluralisme à l'ère des sociétés complexes. And it was translated into English, updated to keep up with new literature, new debate, but also because I went through another round of peer evaluation, which is still common when you translate a book from French to English. And so I worked with McGill-Queen's University Press, and I'm quite happy to present this new fashion of an old new book. And it gives me an opportunity as well to present some of the arguments that might be familiar to Quebec public, but not so much in Canada more broadly, and in the Prairie in particular, when we contrast these models of pluralism that are multiculturalism and interculturalism. And so today in my talk, I will focus only on a small aspect, on a specific aspect that I cover in the book. So I'll talk about issues that I approach both in chapter 1 and chapter 7 of the book, but won't talk about anything in between. So if ever you're interested in these debates, of course, you feel free to look into the other chapters. And in doing so, and I don't know if I can access the PowerPoint now, doing so today, I decided to focus on a game plan, which I hope is quite simple enough to cover all this within 25, 30 minutes, and we can have enough time for discussion. But before I move on to the topic of today's talk, in the book, if I may talk about the general thesis that I try to advance, so I try to argue, it's at least twofold. The first one is that I believe that any public policy or even political theory designed to how should we manage diversity to achieve some form of togetherness that appears reasonable to the vast plurality of its member, I believe that if we focus on a one-size-fits-all model, we're doomed to failure. Why? Because our societies are complex, are made up of various diversity groups, and if we do not keep into consideration that these very groups actually promote different kinds of demands that they're making towards the state, well, we're being to promote policies that will, yes, favor the integration, the accommodation of some groups without taking into consideration the legitimate demands of other groups. And therefore, here in my perspective, asymmetry in this approach is key to success. Any one-size-fits-all policy risk accelerating and amplifying some of the tensions that will exist inevitably in our complex, diversified society. The second thesis that I advance in the book it's not that of a thesis, but it's more of a statement. We need to clarify our concept whenever we talk about issues that deal with togetherness, diversity management. Why? Simply because if someone's making a statement about multiculturalism being a failure, which has been said many times over the past 2 decades, well, if we don't have a common understanding of what multiculturalism here, we can agree to disagree to that statement, but it has no analytical value. Therefore, I believe that we must focus considerable energy to clarify our concept, and I will try to do part of it today with you. So my game plan, quite simple today. Conceptual clarification first. Then I will try to differentiate, but at the same time stress what interculturalism and multiculturalism share, as they are both models of pluralism, both normative political theory. And then we will focus on an aspect that is closely associated to interculturalism, mostly when we focus on the work of one of its main promoter, scholar Gérard Bouchard, who you might have heard of as he co-chaired the Bouchard-Taylor Commission in 2007-2008, the Commission on the Reasonable Accommodation Crisis in Quebec. And then we will try to apply what we will call the limits to the ad hoc measures of precedence, forms of reasonable accommodation for the majority culture. What are the limits to these measures, and how would this model of interculturalism agree with the main aspects that are being promoted in some controversial bills that have been adopted by the Quebec National Assembly over the past few months, in particular Bill 21. And I've ruled out Bill 26 not because it is no longer of interest, simply because I want to keep the talk short within 30 minutes, and therefore I'll be happy to talk about Bill 96 later on in the discussion, but for the demonstration, I'll focus on Bill 21. So, first thing first, conceptual clarification. It's not proper to pluralism, multiculturalism, if someone's talking about democracy. When I teach Canadian politics, one of the first questions I ask my students is, do we live in a democracy here in Canada? And of course, it's just to stimulate debate. Of course, we live in a democracy in Canada. But if someone has in mind direct democracy, well, no, in Canada, we're not in a direct democracy. We're in a liberal constitutional form of democracy, a representative form of it, and in a parliamentary system. And therefore, there are multiple layers of that democracy, and we need to have a common understanding of it if we want to be able to have clear analytical discussion on these issues. It's the same about multiculturalism, diversity, pluralism. And so what I do in the book, in chapter 1, is that I suggest we promote a ladder of conceptual abstraction. I'm not the first one to use that method. It's actually something that has been promoted by Giovanni Sartori, who's really famous for his typology on party politics, but he did considerable work in political theory more broadly. And what I want to do with this is that I think we must distinguish between the more concrete aspect of these issues toward the more abstract declination or shades of it. And the first thing that we need to clarify is that what do we mean when we talk about diversity in our societies? Well, diversity simply refers to the fact that as citizens, as social scientists, as policy actors, policy makers, we can observe in our society that there is something that we call diversity, that our societies are made of individuals that are diversified, for instance, from an ethnocultural perspective. But saying that a diversified society is necessarily a multiculturalist or promotes multiculturalism is, in my opinion, an epistemological error. It's not enough. We can have a highly diverse society without any politics of multiculturalism whatsoever. So we need to distinguish that factual appreciation of the fact that our societies are diversified. And there are three typical forms of diversity. Of course, we could add nuances to this portrait, but in the book, I focus on these three typical forms. The first form of diversity is when we talk about ethnocultural diversity. Mostly when we talk about this, we refer to more or less recent waves of migration. This will include sometimes religious group, but also is simply individual coming from a foreign country that wants to retain some aspect of their cultural heritage, for instance. The second form of diversity that we need to distinguish from the first one is societal or national diversity. And I like to refer to that component of diversity using Peter Russell's concept or idea of incomplete conquest. In some societies, as in Canada, there were attempts to conquer some population, some societal community that existed, and these conquests were in the end incomplete. And we can refer here in Canada to Quebec, for instance, the francophone populations at large, and of course to indigenous peoples. These are said to be societal or national form of diversity because they do promote differentiated form of demands if we compare these to groups of ethnocultural diversity. For instance, members of ethnocultural diversity most of the time will be asking the state to accommodate them in their complex journey to integrate the society, public culture, institutions, etc., etc. They want to integrate that society in some way or the other. For national societal diversity, they're not asking the state to accommodate them in their process to integrate that larger society. They want to make a society of their own. They want to have their own set of institutions. They want to exist as whole society of their own, for instance. And therefore, they're not asking the same thing towards the state. Now, there's also another component of diversity, diversity that is diversity coming out of internal schism. And if we look at countries such as the Netherlands, well, you know all this better than I do, I believe here, but after the process of the Reformation, the schism that was fueled by the Catholics versus the Protestant world, well, it brought up in the Netherlands the liberals, the Catholic, and the Protestant, or the reformist here. And therefore, this is another form of diversity that exists that is asking as well a differentiated demands towards the state. Now, we need to distinguish diversity from public policies that are aiming to address that issue of diversity. How should we be managing diversity? And so when I talk about public policies here, be them related to multiculturalism or interculturalism, for instance, these are public policies, so broadly speaking, programs that are established by a legitimate form of government authority for a given political community over a specific time. Well, these are policies that have the objective to manage and to accommodate diversity in one way or the other. These public policies can be theoretically driven, but they can also be applied from a more ad hoc basis. Here in Canada, when we adopted the multiculturalism policy in 1971, it didn't come out of a very coherent political theory. It came out of a discourse of Pierre Trudeau in May 1971 without he even discussing this issue with his cabinet. It was a way for him to react to the discussions in the BNB Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission of Laurando and Dunton after he adopted already the official act languages a few years ago. Therefore, a public policy is a way to manage diversity. It's not the same than diversity, and some countries will adopt public policies using a top-down approach like Canada, but other countries like the United Kingdom will never institutionalize a formal multiculturalist policy. Rather, it's more of a bottom-up perspective. You have municipalities, local authorities that play a crucial role in that direction, and that is quite different from what we have here in Canada, an official policy since 1971. In 1982, it was entrenched in our constitutional order, section 27 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, and then later on in 1988, we adopted in Canada the official law on multiculturalism, and throughout its journey, multiculturalism was reframed on several occasions. In 2010, for instance, we added new objective to the policy of multiculturalism, stressing even more the duty to integrate when newcomers arrive. Multiculturalism in Canada, even though people don't necessarily think of it when they reflect about multiculturalism, is a policy of integration of newcomers, ethnocultural diversity within culturally dominant institutions. Now, in Quebec, I won't talk too much about the concrete policy of interculturalism. I'll focus more on the theoretical aspect of it. But for you to know, as soon as in Canada we adopted the policy of multiculturalism in 1971, a few weeks later, Robert Bourassa, who was the Premier of Quebec, leader of the Liberal Party, sent a letter to Pierre Trudeau indicating that Quebec will not be applying multiculturalism because it would in some way fragilize Quebec society. Quebec would like to have its own policy of integration where people would be encouraged to integrate Quebec's own whole society. Therefore, there is a sensibility towards Quebec existing as a whole society that is not the same than Canada as a whole. Now, interculturalism was never completely institutionalized. In 1981, under Gérald Godin, who was a famous cabinet minister under René Lévesque, he introduced somehow a policy that was called cultural convergence. And it's kind of the foundation where interculturalism in Quebec was founded. A decade later, in 1990, there was another public policy in which we don't talk about interculturalism per se, but they talk about the idea that there is a moral contract between newcomers and the whole society, that both parties need to make efforts to make the other party feel home, and that it is a duty both to integrate and to recognize diversity. Now, in the 1990s, there was a clear aspect of economic plus value to having newcomers, but the cultural sensitivity was still there. Now, in 2007, 2008, we had this Bouchard-Taylor Commission on the reasonable accommodation crisis you might have heard of. One of the key recommendations of Bouchard-Taylor's report, Gérard Bouchard, famous sociologist and historian at the Université du Québec at Chicoutimi, and Charles Taylor, famous political theorist at McGill University, they concluded that Quebec should introduce as soon as possible an official policy of interculturalism to counterbalance the symbolic narrative of Canadian multiculturalism. The issue is that even though since then every political parties that took power or even that is represented in the Quebec National Assembly, they all said at one point or the other that they are in favor of interculturalism, and if that they take power, they would legislate on it. They never did. So interculturalism is still an unofficial policy in Quebec, even though a lot of civil servants will refer to that idea, but the issue is that there is no clear conception, understanding of what it means. There are multiple theoretical understanding of it, but as long as there is no single formal policy of it, it's kind of difficult to say this is what interculturalism stand for, in contrast to Canadian multiculturalism. And at the same time, multiculturalism evolved quite a lot since the 1970s, and so the differences are not as important as they used to be in the 1970s, in my understanding. Now, that being said, I go on to the third aspect, the third layer of my conceptual clarification, which is when we talk about pluralism. I believe when we talk about pluralism, we need to distinguish this from both public policy and diversity per se. Pluralism refer, in my perspective, to these reasoned normative, more or less consistent conception of togetherness and how to manage diversity in complex societies to achieve some desirable form of togetherness. Pluralism is always entailing a normative political program, whereas if we contrast it to diversity, it's only at a factual level, and public policies are programs implemented by public authorities. So we need to distinguish all this, and the rest of the discussion will focus mostly on that theoretical aspect of pluralism. Now, after I've reviewed most important work over multiculturalism and interculturalism in my book, I focus a lot on Will Kimlicka's work, Tariq Modood in the UK, and Biku Parek, Anne Phillips, Charles Taylor, Sheila Benhabib, for instance, and I come up with that general definition of what most theories of pluralism, either multiculturalism or interculturalism, they all follow this spirit or these general guidelines. There are 3 points basically. In some, multiculturalism or interculturalism as model of pluralism, after they recognize that society is made up of a more or less prominent form of ethnocultural diversity, they all reject assimilation as a way to go. They reject the Jacobin or Anglo-conformity approach, meaning of assimilating minorities into the mainstream culture. They rather support a normative political approach to managing such diversity that, second, favors the integration of individuals through the midst of the general society. Therefore, they want to guarantee equal human dignity of all. And here we see that multiculturalism policy are not disconnected to policies of redistribution. I believe that they can go hand in hand. And third, after they reject assimilation, they favor some form of integration. They believe that we need to ensure equal respect for each individuals, and this is implemented through politics of recognition. Most easy way to understand it is approaches to reasonable accommodation practices here in Canada, to adapt general norms to make it that individuals might not suffer discrimination, whereas most of the population won't suffer discrimination towards that general rule. So it's the adaptation of a general rule to avoid any form of discrimination. Now, interculturalism and multiculturalism as theoretical model of pluralism, they all share these 3 aspects. They reject assimilation, they say yes to politics of recognition, and they favor some form of integration. So what differentiate mainly interculturalism from multiculturalism? Well, what I argue in the book is that even though they share these key principles, it's the way that they narrate their importance. The narrative is different in interculturalism and that in multiculturalism. Basically, when we look at the way that multiculturalism has been presented, promoted, mostly in mainstream debate, it goes into that way. You say no to assimilation, and first of all, there's a duty to put forward politics of recognition. This is the main aspect that you put forward. Your whole discourse over multiculturalism in Canada is founded on the duty to recognize diversity and through various forms of politics of recognition. And finally, this will lead to some form of integration of newcomers, of ethnocultural diversity within the general society because of language, because of cultural practices, because of how economy works, and people will find job. If they benefit from politics of recognition, they will eventually end up integrating the majority culture in some way or the other, which doesn't mean assimilation. You can integrate without rejecting your whole cultural background. Interculturalism proceeds in a different way. It says no to assimilation, but it will favor first the duty of integration. This is the most important aspect in interculturalism. You say you need to integrate newcomers within your own host society. Otherwise, your own host society will end up disappearing. It will cease to exist. And therefore, you cannot focus first and foremost on politics of recognition. You need to have the integration aspect of it, but before, when you present this policy, this model, and then you have some form of politics of recognition that are presented as being the best way to achieve some form of integration. So the main difference, in my opinion, between interculturalism and multiculturalism is not the value that they promote, it's the way that you present these value. What is the finality versus the means in some way. And so to put it in a more theoretical way, we can say that they both promote differentiated myths or paradigms as to how should we be managing and accommodating diversity. Interculturalism will mostly be fueling the myth of duality. And here I inspire myself a lot from Gérard Bouchard's work. And when we talk about the myth or paradigm of duality, it's the idea that the paradigm stems from the recognition that in a multinational democracy as Canada, made up of multiple national partners, a minority nation is said to be legitimate to project itself as a singular whole society that wishes to integrate ethnocultural minorities within its own societal culture. Multiculturalism in Canada will rather be founded on the paradigm of diversity. Its guiding premise is that society is composed of a collection of individuals and ethnocultural groups placed on an equal footing and protected by the same laws. There is no recognition of majority culture and, in consequence, no national minorities per se. Basically, Bouchard's understanding of Canadian politics of multiculturalism, the idea that there should not be any minority groups that is more or less Canadian than another. That's why under Pierre Trudeau in the 1970s, we renounced to biculturalism and only focused on bilingualism. There was to be a multiculturalist society where no minority groups could be said to be more or less Canadian than the other, either because of French descendants or English descendants, right? And therefore, this is more related to the myth of diversity. My understanding is that interculturalism, and in my book, I don't think of interculturalism as being something that is only valuable for Quebec. I think it's a model of great value for similar cases of minority nations in the world, be that Catalonia, Scotland, cases, Wallonia, for instance, in Belgium, similar cases that have a distinct culture, that are part of a larger sovereign state that wishes so far to maintain their relationship with that larger sovereign state, yet to retain their own specific cultural identity and societal understanding of how they are host societies themselves. This myth of duality and interculturalism more broadly seems to work best for minority nations that in some way fear for their collective future as a community. This is something that is of high preoccupation both for their political leaders and for the society at large. If you do not address that collective fear, it may fuel higher percentage of the population feeling uncomfortable towards having a diversified society. If you address this, you might find a way to balance this. And this is what interculturalism proposes in the end. Whereas diversity, the myth of diversity, it works best for cultural majority that in the end does not fear so much for its collective future as Canada here, as an English culture in North America, language will not disappear. Now, this comes maybe with another form of fear that is Canadian specific culture being leveled down because of its proximity with the American culture. That's another issue that we could address in another aspect. But generally speaking, if you compare Quebec's francophone culture to Canadian anglophone culture, there's no similarity in terms of when you look at the people, whether they fear about their collective future as a community bearing a specific culture. Now, interculturalism is also a model that puts forward the idea that not only minorities should benefit from politics of recognition from reasonable accommodation, but a majority culture also up to a certain extent. And this is what Gérard Bouchard promotes when he talks about elements of ad hoc precedence for the majority culture. And to avoid any confusion, I'll just quote this plainly and then we'll discuss it. Quote, he said, I say ad hoc because it is out of the question to formalize or establish this idea as a general legal principle which would lead to the creation of two classes of citizens. In this way, interculturalism distinguishes itself from radical republicanism that, whether directly or not, use the pretext of universalism to best out a systematic a priori precedence on what I term the majority or foundational culture. This kind of arrangement, which established a formal hierarchy, opens the door to abuses of power. That said, I think that as long as the nature and the reach of ad hoc precedence are carefully circumscribed, it can avoid the excesses of ethnicism while giving some advantages of the needed protection to the cultural majority, I think is what is written down under the black spot here. And so I was puzzled myself when I encountered this argument in Gérard Bouchard's work. Say, okay, if you say that ad hoc measures are important to counterbalance that fear of disappearing as a collective majority, what should be then the limits to these ad hoc precedence measures for them not to create an unfair environment towards ethnocultural minorities while trying to secure a better, fairer environment for the minority nation? And my first intuition was to lean into Will Kimlicka's work, where he differentiates between what he calls measures of internal constraint and measures of external protection. And basically, measures of internal constraint, they are aimed to preserve cultural essence from external cultural and sociopolitical dynamics. And Will Kimlicka say, no, these are too illiberal. We cannot put them forward. We cannot use this as favoring some politics of pluralism, but we should accept measures of external protection that are aimed rather to rebalance power relationships between societal communities in a multinational democracy. Now, the issue is that if we take, for instance, the case of Bill 101 that was adopted in Quebec in 1977, the idea was clearly to act as a measure of external protection to rebalance measures of power relationship. But at the same time, it restricted the capacity of newcomers to go into school into English, and so it restricted individual liberties of people living in the territory of Quebec. It restricted also the capacity of enterprises to advertise their products only in English or predominantly in English. And so it's both a measure of external protection and of internal constraint up to a certain degree. So what do we do with this? Well, Will Kimlicka himself say it brings us to a dilemma. He believed in the end that we should accept mild illiberal practices to allow liberal societal culture to flourish. I'm kind of inclined to accept this conclusion, but it's still unsatisfactory to come up with a clear analytical framework to say what should we accept as legitimate measures of ad hoc precedence and what should we not accept. And what I decided to do in the book, I do two things. One that is more theoretical. I advance what I call a pluralism test, which is completely normative and theoretical. The problem is that it remains at a very abstract level. What I'll do with you today is the second aspect, more concrete application of this. I apply this to the Canadian case and ask myself, what would the tribunals say in Canada about the limits of these ad hoc precedence measures? And the answer I came up with is that we would need to look into the Oakes test, something that you might have heard of a crucial decision, I think in 1986, by the Supreme Court of Canada. And in the Oakes test, basically what the Supreme Court of Canada says is that Section 1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom guarantees, and I quote here, guarantees the right and freedom set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits as can be demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. So what are those limits? Well, the Supreme Court of Canada answered that question for us. So the Oakes test suggests that the objective to be served by the measures limiting a charter right must be sufficiently important to warrant overriding a constitutionally protected right. Freedom. They present three criteria. The first criteria, they say, and this is, I quote here, to begin with, the measures must be fair and not arbitrary, carefully designed to achieve the objective in question and rationally connected to that objective. Second, in addition, the means should impair the right in question as little as possible. And lastly, there must be a proportionality between the effects of limiting measure and the objective. The more severe the deleterious effects of a measure, the more important the objective must be. Now, I believe that when you look at a bill like Bill 21, an act respecting the laicity of the state, the court would see that this is indeed a measure aimed to rebalance power relations between Quebec as a minority nation that wants to preserve its own societal culture and make it distinct from the rest of Canada. It's a way to implement a differentiated conception of secularism, of liberty, of collective liberty as well, within the same country. It's a more substantive form of liberalism in the line of what we call in political theory, liberal nationalism from Yael Tamir's work in the 1990s, for instance. And they would come to that conclusion, I believe, when they look at the 4 key principles, the finalities of Bill 21, which are the following: the separation of the state and religion, the religious neutrality of the state, the equality of all citizens, freedom of conscience, and freedom of religion. When you look at these principles, I don't believe this is highly problematic. So the finalities of the bill, I believe, are quite consensual. They don't pose any serious problem. The issue, though, is what are the means that have been identified by the legislator in Quebec to adapt these finality into concrete public policy. I'll focus on only one aspect, the most conflictual aspect of it. They say that it's already in application. It proposes a ban on religious symbol for all public workers in position of authority. And when you look at sections 2 and 8 of the bill, it includes, for instance, police officers, judges, prison guards, teachers, and school principals. And the rationale for that is that it is said that wearing religious symbol necessarily leads to proselytism. Therefore, it would be contra the principle of religious neutrality of the state. Looking back at the Oakes test, what would be the conclusion of the Supreme Court of Canada on this? Of course, I'm no judge. I'm not even a jurist. I'm a political scientist. But my understanding of it is that the first thing that we will look on is that aspect here. Wearing religious symbols necessarily leads to proselytism. If you have seen one empirical study that demonstrates this, I'll be the first one that I want to look into it, and I'll accept the argument. But as long as I've never seen any compelling evidence of any empirical study that says that wearing religious symbol necessarily leads to proselytism, I believe that this is too great of an infringement here. It's not proportional. The effects are unproportional to what it brings on the matter of individuals that are concerned with this. The second aspect that would be problematic is that who are these people in position of authority, and what do we mean by this? And I think here we move from an empirical argument or even philosophical argument to a sociological one. When we look at the first category of public workers in position of authority, police officers, judges, prison guards, I think there could be an argument made that the court might accept that because these people here represent the state in their function, that police officers, judges, prison guards can have a coercive action on you. They can decide to put you in jail. They can decide on how you will be living your day, literally. I do not believe that they're in a position of authority the same way that teacher and school principals are. Of course, teachers and school principals have a form of authority towards their students, their pupils. But I do not believe it's of the same value or same symbolic matter than prison guards, police officers, and judges. And therefore, I believe that using the Oakes test, because of that argument, first philosophical or empirical, and then because of the sociological argument, they would, at the very least, strike down the effect of this bill on teachers and school principals. And so, in the end, I believe that looking at these 3 criteria would be a way to say, well, part of the bill would be acceptable even in the eyes of the Supreme Court of Canada. Do not forget that in its reference racist session of Quebec,
incremental nature of it.
In the reference racist session of Quebec in 1998, the Supreme Court of Canada itself said that in Canada there may exist 2 equally legitimate majorities in the state. Therefore, there can be competing visions of secularism, tolerance that can coexist in the liberal society. Because of this, I believe they would be inclined not to strike down the whole bill. Also because of the political consequences that might come out of this. But mostly, I'm pretty sure that this aspect, teachers and school principals, because both of the empirical non-evidence of this, and also because of the sociological argument to say it might be appropriate for police officers, judges, and prison guards, they would strike this down. So I believe that Bill 21 can be understood as a form of ad hoc measures, precedence measures for the protection of the majority culture, but only up to a certain extent, and that aspects of it are quite problematic, and I believe this is how it might play out when it will go in front of the Supreme Court of Canada, because it's not the question of if, it's a question of when. The bill is already in front of the courts right now. So I'll end up here. I've talked at least 10 minutes longer than I expected, but I'm happy to continue the discussion with you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I enjoyed it. I think I'd like to make a couple of comments, if I may. As an immigrant to Canada, I would say multiculturalism is rhetoric, not a reality. So I think there's a fair bit of pressure for immigrants to assimilate. I mean, we talk about integration and respecting traditions, but I would say there's a fair bit of unstated yet clear expectation to assimilate culturally, linguistically, and so on. So if interculturalism is as much of a myth as multiculturalism is, I think that should be acknowledged. That there is this, there's what we say we want, and then there is what actually happens. And so paying attention to the experience of immigrants, and of course, in the case of Quebec, and people who live there who are not primarily francophone, it would be an interesting exercise to see what their experiences are and how they contrast to the stated political ideology. And the other observation I would make is that, like France, it seems to me Quebec and France both have secularism almost as a de facto religion. It has almost the same status, I think, as a religion, a small r religion, in that it is an ideology that people adhere to, and it imposes certain behaviors on people. And so, and that is a form of assimilation. So I think it's important to, on both in Quebec with interculturalism and the rest of Canada with multiculturalism, to acknowledge that there is a rhetoric, but that one of the main forces is still that of assimilation. And let's not be coy about that reality.
Yeah, so as a rhetoric, of course it is a rhetoric. However, I would say it's not only as a rhetoric, like it's a real public policy with quite a lot of money. And every year, there's, in every ministry today, since 1988, there are these offices that are in charge of implementing the general objective of multiculturalism. So I agree, multiculturalism and interculturalism, I entirely agree with you. It's a lot about rhetoric. It's a lot about a narrative. And most important public policies become so important because they become part of, for instance, here in Canada about multiculturalism. It's key to understanding contemporary political DNA in Canada. It replaced that old Britishness understanding of what the Canadian we was at some point, I believe, in the second half of the 20th century. Absolutely, it is a rhetoric. Looking at how people live this is absolutely crucial. It is not something that I myself do in my own research. I have colleagues, though. I'm thinking of Mireille Paquet, for instance, from Concordia University, or Paul May from the Université du Québec à Montréal, that are doing these field work, that are talking with immigrants to understand the trajectories and how they both perceive and they live these rhetorics and these policies. I think this is absolutely crucial. Unfortunately, my work here is absolutely not on track with these issues. I focus more on the institutional aspect and on the political theory relationship it has with it. But I'm not saying that it's not important. I absolutely agree with you that it is crucial and we need more knowledge of this if we want to develop public policies that are actually achieving what we want them to achieve. So absolutely regarding that point on rhetoric. Now, secularism becoming a form of civic religion, you are absolutely right. And in France, there's a colleague, David Coussens, at the University of Sherbrooke, that did a fantastic work on comparing Quebec secularism and French secularism and how it evolved. In French, he shows that since before the 1990s, basically, laicite or secularism, it was all about the 1905 law on separation, on the separation of state and religion. It was not a value to promote, it was a state of fact to put forward. And in the 1990s and moreover in the early 2000s, it became a key component to think of the identity, to think of the we. And the most clear evidence of this in Quebec was during the 18 months where the Parti Québécois was in power between 2012 and 2014 with their charter of values or charter of laïcité. And this was, at some point, they decided to put laïcité as a key value for the Quebec identity itself, as gender equality and laïcité. And at this point, there is a discursive shift that operated. A decade before, the experts that were talking about laïcité or secularism, they mostly had an open conception of secularism. I'm thinking of Jocelyn McClure, McGill University, Charles Taylor as well, where they say we should not promote here in Quebec a conception of laïcité that is closely linked to this French conception of secularism. We should have a conception of it that is more open to not assimilation, but more deliberation between what should be the core common identity that is always a negotiation between its parties. Of course, some come from dominant majority culture, whereas newcomers will bring their own conception of it and will transform that identity in the whole process. And that open secularism conception of laïcité gradually faded out since the 2007-2008 and became what we know today under the Coalition Avenir Québec's understanding of it, a French-inspired Republican-style laïcité. And this here promotes a more positive conception of liberty that connects more with republicanism, focus a lot on the preservation of the majority culture. And in this way, absolutely, it promotes a form of cultural assimilation. But the thing is that in Quebec, there are politics of newcomers integration that has nothing to do with assimilation since the 1970s and 80s. And therefore, if you talk to people that works in the Ministère de l'Immigration et de la Francisation in Quebec, they're not working towards implementing politics of assimilation at all. And so therefore, there is resistance both within society, both within politics, policy organization, but there is a will in a key part of the population and part of the party that is governing right now to promote a more hardcore Republican conception of it. But the debate is far from closed. I mean, there's a lot of people that wanted to have a bill on laïcité in Quebec, but are still not satisfied at all with the current form of it because precisely it might promote too much a form of republicanism that is going a bit too far in the opinion of many.
Well, thank you. And of course, Canada is not a republic. So, yeah, okay, thank you.
But I mean, you can promote a form of republicanism without being a republic. I mean, there's the ideology that is something that you need to focus on. La chose commune, res publica, the Latin conception of it, and the Republican form of government. You can have a Republicanist ideology in a constitutional monarchy. It can cohabitate up to a certain extent.
Yeah. And we're looking for where that limit is, with, for instance, MPs deciding, or MNAs deciding not to acknowledge the crown, and so on. Okay, thank you very much.
We'll have a lot of debates in the following.
Oh yeah.
weeks about this.
Yeah.
Actually, I have two questions for you. First of all, there has been a tendency, especially with the growing tech sector in Montreal, for landed immigrants to arrive in Anglophone Canada, and then to, after a few years, perhaps to move on to Montreal while still unilingual Anglophones, to take up careers there and quite often to remain unilingual in Montreal. Do we know anything about how life is for them and how things are working out on that front? And the second question is, you mentioned that the Trudeau government formulated multiculturalism without discussing it with cabinet. How was it designed? Was it just the PMO alone, or was it just the PM and the civil service?
I'll answer the first question first. It's quick. Like, yes, it was the PMO, part of the PMO with Pierre Trudeau, and he came into a chamber and decided to set out these 4 key objectives of multiculturalism that are still there today. It's a foundation of it, but nobody really heard of it before. And multiculturalism had been discussed a few years before, actually here in the Prairie, during the audiences of the BNB Commission, mostly from Ukrainian Canadian, that said, well, we like this conception of bilingualism, but biculturalism, not at all. We don't feel we are part of either the British descent or English, French descent. Therefore, we would prefer a multicultural conception of it. And at that point, it didn't resonate that much. And André Laurendeau was a really powerful intellectual at that point. And I would say the power relation, intellectually speaking, between him and Pierre Trudeau during the first part of the 1960s, André Laurendeau had the biggest argument, the most convincing argument here. André Laurendeau died in 1968, at the same time, basically, that Pierre Trudeau arrived in power. And at that point, Pierre Trudeau used that discursive preach about multiculturalism and made it a real success story in Canada. But it wasn't a really fully taught conception of it. I don't believe that Pierre Trudeau had any big scheme of what multiculturalism should stand by in the future. It happened as an ad hoc gradual process. And Canada was the first country ever to adopt a policy of multiculturalism. So he was not trying to implement something that existed elsewhere. It was an attempt that was very successful in the end, designed, from my understanding, from a small proportion of his advisors in the PMO. The first question, I don't have any specific knowledge about. I know Montreal has big tech companies, Ubisoft and stuff like that, and there has been issues, mediatic issues as well, about people that are hired to go there, and at some point they're expected to learn French. And this is an issue. And how can we make people arriving in Quebec learn French? Well, there are many programs that exist. The most typical ones are courses of francisation for people to learn French. It's paid by the government. You can have also funds if you, for instance, have children, to have your children at daycare. The time you go there, you can also have your fees of your cost of transportation covered by the government if you want to go there. There's a lapse of time in between you need to do this. You can do it intensely or more gradually. In the past, the real success story, in my understanding, was when enterprises were giving these courses of francisation within their own organization. And since the early 2000s, this approach was gradually abandoned for various reasons that I'm not entirely aware of. Some exceptions were still granted, but these Ubisoft company, not at all. And I believe that if there's a way to address that issue in a reasonable way, would be to make sure that companies themselves, corporations themselves, has the flexibility to offer courses of francisation within their own workforce. And that would, I believe, facilitate a lot that process here. So that would be my take to how address that issue, but I don't know much about the concrete aspect of it.
And do they find it easy away from work to integrate into the community, or do they tend to sort of remain sub-communities?
Well, in Montreal today, in various parts of the cities, you can absolutely live your life in English without issue. If you go east of St. Lawrence Street, for instance, it'll be more difficult not to speak French if you want to go to the restaurants and any places. And that's because in Quebec there's only one official language, and it's French. It's not a bilingual province. Only New Brunswick is a bilingual province. So that's how it is. But the concrete lived experience of it, I don't know. I don't have any empirical evidence about this myself.
I have a question online, and Christine Legal, if you would like to ask your question, you can unmute yourself if you like, or I will read your question for you. Not hearing your voice, it's a good question, so I'll read it for her. Wonderful talk. I'm a French Canadian from the West Coast and grew up with a strong sense of the French language culture being threatened. both historically and currently. How do you see these debates on multi-interculturalism affecting minority francophones outside of Quebec?
That is a big question. I think there's a lot of research that needs to be done here. A key turning point was in the 1950s and 60s. There was these États généraux sur le Canada français, where Quebec nationalism became modern Quebec nationalism, centered itself over the Quebec territory, and the idea eventually became to make an independent state of Quebec. In doing so, in the process, there is a schism that operated between the Quebec identity and the Canadiens français hors Québec, the French Canadians outside of Quebec. And I believe that until recently, I mean until 2017, the Quebec government for a few decades did very little to influence and to stimulate discussions with civil societies, francophone civil societies across the country. Since 2017, there's an official policy in Quebec that funds research on this, but also is also funding civil society organization partnerships to at least know what are the challenges that communities are facing, how can we think of solutions, and how the success stories of some communities can play a role elsewhere. And I believe that the fact that today it's more clear than it was a few decades ago, I believe you would agree with me here, that Quebec is in Canada to stay until new context, right? Well, as long as Quebec believes it's here to stay in Canada, it might be important for Quebec to play a more active role in trying to dynamize discussions about the cultural fragility of francophones, not only in Quebec, but also in Canada, throughout the country, because francophone communities here in Manitoba, in Winnipeg, I was very fortunate when I arrived here in Winnipeg to meet a lot of fellow French Canadians in the city, and that helped a lot my own integration to Winnipeg, and I came to learn a lot about their own issues here that I was absolutely unaware, because we don't know these issues in Quebec when you think about a different kind of issues. So I do believe there's a lot more to be done here. The problem, I would say, is that Canadian federalism per se is ill organized to actually address these issues. I believe that provinces have the responsibility to address these, but there are no great incentives, electorally speaking, for instance, for most provincial governments to invest a lot of money and energy into these issues. So I think it's really difficult. These are issues that we need to think of a lot in the near future.
I'll just read one comment, and maybe there's one more question in the room. This is a comment from an attendee online. Kind of echoes a little bit of what Dr. Mathieu was saying. I'll just read it because it is a comment. Thank you for the presentation. It was very insightful. Many people, including me, were drawn to Canada because of its diversity and multiculturalism. My experience so far have made me begin to think if this is truly so. I see more of assimilation than multiculturalism. It will do more good if we call it what it is and maybe move forward from there. So just a little bit echoing Dr. Mathieu, that is someone who is online, Rachel. So is there one final question?
I can just say a quick word on that, because and that's the other thing. Multiculturalism, as we said, it is a rhetoric, it is a narrative, and there is a difference between how it is branded, globally speaking, in the discourses of our Prime Minister, for instance, when you go to Times Magazine or in London and say diversity is Canada's strength, and how it actually operates. And people, when they think of multiculturalism, they arrive here, and in the end, multiculturalism is an integrationist policy, and therefore I think there is a duty on the part of Canada to be a better player and to be upfront about what multiculturalism actually is. It is about making people integrate the core institutions and the culture, the Canadian culture, whatever we may call it. So I think the issue is that multiculturalism is branded, globally speaking, and also in our education curriculum at the high school level, for instance, in a way that is unfair to what it actually is, concretely speaking.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's good. It's a bit of a relief. Okay, thank you again, Dr. Mathieu, for your presentation today and for being so generous to have some of us in the room with you and some of us from afar coming in. So thank you again for your presentation. And I'd just like to remind everyone who is listening in that our next Brown Bag lecture will be on January 13th, and we will be sending out further details to you about that lecture. It seems far away, but it will be here soon enough. So again, thank you very much for a very interesting lecture.
Thank you so much.